The final scoop was served, and so was a silent threat no one noticed. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Let me know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. I read every message and they truly mean a lot. Let's begin the case. It was a Thursday, precisely 11:56 a.m., and the thermostat in the brownstone was locked in its usual standoff with the outside world, set to Wolfe's preferred level of refrigerated smugness. I had just returned from a brief, uneventful errand to the corner florist, one of those errands Wolfe only issues when he's trying to prove he remembers the outside world exists, when the front door buzzed with the kind of urgency that suggests either bad news or a vacuum cleaner salesman with a guilt complex. I peeked through the peephole, saw the silhouette of a man shaped like a shaved-down fire hydrant, and made the executive decision not to ignore him. He looked sweaty, scared, and stuffed into a summer suit that had seen better springs. I opened the door and gave him my best raised eyebrow. Planning to melt into the rug or just scuff the welcome mat? He shoved in before I could get a name, eyes darting like he'd just robbed a pastry cart and heard sirens. You're Archie Goodwin, right? He wheezed. That's the rumor. And unless your next line involves a check or criminal intrigue, you're blocking the airflow. He clutched a small leather bag with one hand and wiped his forehead with the other. I need to see Nero Wolfe. It's about something that might not look like a crime, but it is. It is. Most things are when you squint hard. Enough, I said. A name. Antonio Bellini. My family owns Bellini Gelateria. We've been around since 1903, the original shop on Mulberry Street. My grandfather used to hand-churn every scoop. Fantastic. Do you want to add a Yelp review, or should I see if Wolfe's appetite extends to frozen desserts? He practically vibrated with desperation. It's not about the gelato. It's about what was in the gelato. One scoop, the last scoop. That got me. I didn't flinch, but I paused, which for me is a dead giveaway something's wrong. I led Bellini inside and told him to keep his panic off the Persian rug. Wolfe was, naturally, in the plant room, whispering to his orchids like they were heirs to the Roman Empire. I informed him with appropriate delicacy that a man with gelato and murder on his lips was in the front room, looking 2 degrees from cardiac arrest. Wolfe's reaction was a grunt. Not quite curiosity, not quite disinterest. Gelato, Archie. Says, it's not about the gelato, but about something that was in it. Also says it might be a crime. He emerged 15 minutes later. 15. Because nothing disturbs the sacred hours of orchid maintenance, not even an espresso-laced homicide. Bellini was still pacing when Wolfe entered, and I admit I enjoy the moment when the average citizen first lays eyes on Nero Wolfe, half astonishment, half wonder, at how a man that size ever fit through childhood. Wolfe seated himself in the oversized chair, adjusted his napkin as if preparing for judgment instead of lunch, and motioned with 2 fingers. Proceed. Bellini's story poured out like an overfilled cone. He claimed someone had tampered with their house-made hazelnut gelato. Just one batch, served at an exclusive private event hosted by an old family friend, Lorenzo Drago, i.e., retired restaurateur and social climber, who recently opened a high-end supper club in Soho. Apparently that last scoop was meant for Drago himself. Instead, it went to a food critic named Celia Knott, who left halfway through dessert, never returned to the table, and hadn't been seen or heard from since. According to Bellini, she wasn't missing, just vanished. No body, no scene, no note, just gone. You're suggesting, Wolfe said, that a woman disappeared as a result of consuming your gelato. Bellini shook his head frantically. No, yes, I mean, maybe. I think someone planned for her to get that scoop. That flavor was supposed to be off-menu, special. But I found the recipe card had been altered, the labels changed. It wasn't hazelnut. It was something else. I think someone poisoned it and swapped the intended recipient. Why not the police? Wolfe asked. I went, Bellini said. They laughed, said it was a romantic spat, that maybe she ghosted him or took a weekend off. No foul play, no evidence. Wolfe closed his eyes. Why us? Bellini hesitated, then looked right at me. Because the man who ordered that last scoop wasn't Lorenzo Drago. It was someone using his name. And the name was written in your handwriting. I blinked. Wolfe opened one eye, The air changed. Bellini reached into his bag and produced a printed guest list from the supper club, handed it to me. I scanned down. Sure enough, my name. A full reservation in my handwriting, with the special gelato noted as a final course request. Only I'd never been there. And I sure as hell didn't order dessert for a woman I'd never met. Bellini twisted his hands. I think someone impersonated you, Mr. Goodwin. I think it's all connected. And I think someone's trying to melt this whole thing away before anyone notices. Wolfe opened both eyes now. Archie. Yes, sir. Postpone lunch. That's how you know it's serious. The moment Bellini dropped that little bomb about my handwriting, Wolfe froze. Not in surprise, mind you. Surprise is beneath him. But in that rigid, reflective way that means some wheel up there has started turning, and God help anyone in the path of its eventual momentum. He waved a hand like Caesar, dismissing a mildly annoying senator, and said, Archie, the list. I handed it over. Wolfe adjusted his glasses, leaned back a millimeter further into the upholstery, and stared at the paper with the same focus he usually reserves for rare orchids and the wine. List at Rusterman's. He didn't speak for a solid minute. I used the time to study Bellini, who had settled into the red armchair and was fidgeting with the strap of his bag like it had personally offended him. You say, Wolfe began at last, that this supper club event was private. Bellini nodded quickly. Yes, invitation only. Drago hosts one each month, a small group. He calls them culinary farewells, final meals inspired by what someone would eat before death. Sounds morbid, but people pay good money for the exclusivity. Wolfe sighed, muttered something under his breath in German, then looked at me. And your connection to Drago? None, I said. Never met the man, never been to the supper club. If someone used my name, they forged everything, including the handwriting. Wolfe tapped the paper with a finger. Your imitation, if it is that, is skilled. The loops are correct, the slope is precise. If it were placed beside a genuine sample of your script, I doubt a casual eye would see the difference. I nodded. Okay, so someone studied me close enough to fake my writing, which makes this personal. Bellini was now wringing his hands like a man trying to throttle air. I'm not crazy, am I? I mean, I know it sounds strange, but something's wrong. I can feel it. I've been up every night thinking about it. And then I remembered hearing about you two. You remembered hearing about me, I said. And figured if anyone could wring the truth out of a scoop of doctored gelato, it'd be the big man in the chair. Wolfe closed his eyes again, which usually means he's either meditating on the infinite stupidity of the human race or calculating how much this mess is going to cost him in both calories and patience. Archie, he said, I will take this case. Bellini sat up straight. You will? Yes, because someone has chosen to invoke my assistant's identity. That is, to my mind, a breach not merely of legality, but of taste. And I am disinclined to tolerate such things. That was Wolfe's version of righteous fury, by the way. Not a raised voice, not a slammed fist, just a tone dipped in chilled venom and a pronouncement that guaranteed someone was about to be cornered without ever seeing the trap. Do we start? With Drago, I asked. No, we start with Celia Knott. Find her, or find what remains of her. Either will do. Bellini flinched. Wolfe continued. You say she was a food critic. Where did she work? Bellini fished out a crumpled business card. Eats and Whispers, an online column, high readership. She could make or break a chef. I pocketed the card. Any enemies? Bellini gave a sad little laugh. She reviewed. Our gelato once. Called it transporting but insecure. I still don't know what that means. Nothing, Wolfe said. It is the kind of lexical foam food critics are paid to blow. But that may be precisely why someone took offense. Archie. Go to her office, or failing that, the column's headquarters. I want to know her routine, her recent work, and anyone who stood to gain from her absence. Right. And while you're out, Wolfe added, speak with Fritz. He may need to prepare something suitable for lunch. I find myself disturbed, which is Wolfe's way of saying he'd like veal scallopine with saffron risotto, and wants me to pretend it's tied to the case. I left Bellini sipping water like it might save his soul, and made my way across town to the midtown offices of Eats and Whispers. I expected a dim loft with typewriters, old coffee cups, and unpaid interns. What I found was a fifth-floor suite with more succulents than staff, and a receptionist who looked like she'd rather be punched than answer questions. "Celia not?" I asked, flashing the best version of my ID. "She's on sabbatical," the girl said without looking up from her phone. "Voluntary sabbatical, or the kind that comes after you vanish mid-dessert?" She blinked, and I could see a flicker of worry before she masked it. She said she needed to disconnect, something about palate burnout. She emailed that she'd be off-grid. When? 3 days ago. I whistled low. That was the night of the supper club. I pressed. "Any messages since?" "No." "Anyone else disappear? Anyone covering her columns?" She wrote a backlog, scheduled to auto-publish. "No one else touches her stuff." "Mind if I take a look at her office?" "I do, actually." So I waited until she stepped out to flirt with a delivery guy, then ducked past the frosted glass door marked CK, private. Inside, the space was tight. Books on cuisine, half-finished tasting notes, perfume samples, and a corkboard with clippings of her work. But what caught my eye was a photo pinned up near her desk. A candid black-and-white shot of Celia at a tasting table, surrounded by plates, wine glasses, and seated beside her was a man I recognized instantly from a profile Wolfe had made. Me read 2 years back. Lorenzo Drago. They weren't just colleagues. They were familiar, comfortable, maybe more, and maybe that made it personal. I took a snapshot, locked the office behind me, and ducked out before the receptionist returned. Next stop was Drago's club alibi, tucked into an alley off Broome Street. I didn't announce myself. Just slipped in during prep hour and played the health inspector routine long enough to scan the place. Sleek, pretentious, and full of smells that tried to outdo each other. The chef didn't recognize me. Neither did the maitre d'. But in the basement walk-in fridge I found an unlabeled container stashed behind rows of truffle butter. It was nearly empty. Pale brown gelato, a tiny scoop clinging to the side. I bagged it. Wolfe would want it tested. When I got back to the brownstone, Bellini was gone, but Wolfe was seated with a magnifying glass and a small leather-bound notebook. My notebook. "Where did you find that?" I asked. "In the drawer beneath your Rolodex. It appears someone borrowed it recently." I stared. I hadn't used that drawer in weeks. Wolfe handed it over. Page 23 was missing, torn cleanly. "So someone studied my handwriting," I muttered, "and they did it here. In the brownstone." Wolfe nodded once. "This, Archie, is no longer merely about gelato. It is about trespass, and I do not tolerate trespass. If you want to rile Nero Wolfe, you could spill wine on a first edition of Pliny, mispronounce quiche Lorraine, or breathe too heavily near his orchids. But if you want to see the man disturbed, I mean visibly altered in posture and voice, you trespass. Someone had gotten into the brownstone, into my drawer, stolen a page of my personal notebook, and used it to copy my handwriting. That wasn't just bold, it was surgical. Wolfe didn't need a murder victim to be incensed. This was war by his terms, subtle, strategic, insulting. He sat at his desk staring at the torn notebook like it was a desecrated relic. "The implications are intolerable," he said flatly. "Someone infiltrated this house, our house. Didn't ask if he wanted me to file a police report. He wouldn't. Not yet. Wolfe treats the police like you treat the last olive at a party. If you must interact, do it sparingly and with regret." "They knew where the notebook was," I said. "That means either Bellini's lying or we've been under watch longer." Then we realized. Wolfe didn't respond. He just reached for the bell and summoned Fritz. When Fritz arrived, he was wearing an apron dusted with flour and a face that suggested the souffle had collapsed and taken his afternoon with it. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "have you noticed anyone? Delivery men, contractors, florists, who lingered or asked unusual questions in the past 2 weeks?" Fritz thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, sir, but a man did deliver a parcel last Thursday. He insisted on handing it to me personally. Small, plain box. I placed it on the kitchen counter." "Where?" "Is it now?" "Gone, sir. I assumed you had taken it." I made a mental note. We'd had a ghost in the house, and he came bearing gifts. Bellini by this point was long gone. Wolfe had dismissed him after ringing every relevant detail and detecting no indication of lying or thinking, frankly. Bellini had the nervous energy of a guilty man, but none of the cleverness. That meant he was either being used or about to be discarded by someone smarter. "Archie," Wolfe said, his tone clipped, "what did you find at Knott's office?" Her assistant claims she went off-grid. Burnout. But conveniently she hasn't messaged anyone since the supper club dinner that night. Her office is intact, though I found a photograph that tells a new story, her and Drago. They were close. Smiles and wineglasses close. Wolfe nodded. "And?" "I stopped by Drago's club. Didn't announce myself, naturally. Poked around the prep area. Found a tub of unlabeled gelato in the walk-in fridge. Stashed, like it wasn't meant to be found. It matches the description Bellini gave." "Excellent. Where is it?" "In the freezer, marked for analysis. Have Saul retrieve it and deliver it to Inspector Kramer's preferred lab. Quietly. I want the results before tomorrow." I raised an eyebrow. "Involving Kramer already?" "No. But using his lab guarantees efficiency. Saul knows which palms to grease." Mentioning Saul meant one thing. Wolfe was preparing to escalate. That's how he plays, slow and steady, until someone jostles the board. Then he arranges the pieces for checkmate. I knew my next move was to return to Bellini and shake his tree until a few more nuts fell out. I found him at the gelateria, sleeves rolled, eyes bagged, and apron stained like he'd been mixing regret into every batch. He looked up like a man, waiting for his sentence. "I assume Wolfe had more questions?" he asked. "Always. Tell me about Drago and don't rehearse it. Give me the raw cut." Bellini sighed and leaned against the counter. "My grandfather taught Drago back in Italy. Before the war, Drago apprenticed under him for 2 years. They were close, like family. But when they both came to New York, something happened. Drago opened a trattoria. My grandfather stayed with Gelato. They stopped talking. Jealousy. Maybe. Drago always wanted prestige, awards, Michelin nonsense. My grandfather didn't care. Said food should be simple, pure. Drago called him small-minded. And now," Bellini's mouth twisted, "now Drago plays kingmaker with his supper club. People beg to attend. He serves final meals themed after famous executions, ancient banquets, weird things. That hazelnut batch wasn't even on the menu. He requested it directly. Before or after you saw Celia's name on the guest list?" "Before." That aligned too well. "And when the guest list printed, my name appeared as the orderer of the last scoop." He nodded. "I panicked when I saw it. Thought it was an inside joke. Then Celia disappeared. Something about Bellini's timeline was crooked. He seemed to genuinely believe he was caught in a game he didn't understand, which meant we had another player. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had set up his usual mid-crisis layout. Chair angled, beer in hand, dictionary open to a page he wouldn't explain. He glanced at me and said, "Report." I gave him the Bellini rundown, including the old country feud and Drago's fetish for culinary pageantry. I closed with my hunch. Someone was playing with legacy, Bellini's and Drago's. The dessert wasn't just about Celia or poison. It was about something older, pride, maybe revenge. Wolfe closed the dictionary and muttered, "Hubris, Greek, but applicable." He stood, a rare event, and walked 3 paces to the Globe bar, poured a thimble of brandy, returned without sipping. "That's how serious it was. Archie," he said slowly, "someone who knows this house, our habits, our handwriting, inserted your identity into a tableau designed to humiliate or incriminate, but not permanently. If they wanted to frame you, they'd have gone to the police. Instead, they used you to deliver a message. Message received. What do? We wait for the reply. It came at 7:19 p.m. A small envelope, no stamp, slid under the door like a calling card from a Victorian novel. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, typed, no signature. She ate what wasn't hers, what was meant for someone else, so I gave her time to consider her greed. Let's see if silence suits her taste better. V. Wolfe read it once, then again. "Vanitas," he said. "Latin? Vanity, or emptiness. It may be a signature or an accusation." I tilted my head. "So the mystery man V is punishing Celia for eating the wrong scoop? Or pretending to?" It may be posturing or misdirection, or he's insane. Yes, Wolfe said, but precise and theatrical. We now had a suspect who knew how to mimic my handwriting, penetrate the brownstone, hijack a gelato recipe, and deliver veiled threats with literary flair. All without leaving a single fingerprint. Wolfe sat again, slow and deliberate. This is no longer merely sabotage, this is performance. And we're the audience? No, Wolfe said. We are the critics, and he knows it, which meant the next move belonged to us, or we'd be trapped applauding someone else's finale. Wolfe didn't move for a long time after reading that note. He just sat there, brooding like a statue that had thoughts to rearrange. The envelope lay open. On his desk, its single sheet now paperclipped to a new folder labeled V in my handwriting. Real this time, no forgery. Fritz delivered brandy untouched. Beer sat unopened. That alone told me the brownstone had shifted into DEFCON 2. You believe this V actually has Celia? I asked. Wolfe raised one brow like a bishop mulling over excommunication. No. I believe he wants us to think he does. Whether she is alive or entombed in gelato remains to be seen. Then what's the endgame? Wolfe's eyes half closed. A critic humiliated, a dish substituted, a note left in literary abstraction. This is not about death, not yet. It's about ego, applause, and performance. That fit. Wolfe had seen it before. Some cases hum with violence, this one simmered with pride. Someone was staging scenes like tableaus, adding characters, shifting props, and waiting for us to clap or gasp. And so far, we'd done both. I called Saul Panzer at Wolfe's request. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and expressionless, like he was already halfway through the file. I gave him the order, delivered the gelato sample to the backdoor lab in Queens, the one Kramer's guys used when they didn't want the brass breathing down their necks. Quiet analysis, quick turnaround. No names, no signatures. Then I hit the streets again, my first stop Celia Knott's building. According to the card Bellini gave me, she lived on the Upper West Side, in a pre-war high-rise with a doorman who looked like he'd once guarded the gates of Troy. I gave him my name, told him I was with the Gazette, which was only partly I'd contributed to one of their lesser crime pieces a few years back, under a pseudonym Wolfe still mocks to this day. The doorman, being the type who took rules seriously but liked a good backhanded tip, buzzed me in and gave me the floor. Fifth, apartment 5B, I knocked. No answer. I knocked again and said, Celia. Archie Goodwin, you know the name, and I've got a few questions about dessert. Still nothing. I gave it 20 more seconds, then tested the handle. Locked, but not dead-bolted. I've picked worse. A few moments and a tension wrench later, I was inside. The place was warm, lived in, too lived in. No sign of a sudden exit. The bed was made, the desk neat, shoes aligned. But something was off. No cell phone, no laptop. Just an empty phone charger and a coffee cup that had started. A mold colony on the counter. I did a light sweep. No blood, no broken windows. But the wastebasket in the kitchen had something Wolfe would want to see. A torn envelope addressed to Celia in looping cursive. The return address, Lorenzo Drago, 39 Broome Street, NYC. No letter. Inside. Curious, I pocketed it, then searched the fridge, mostly wine, half a lemon, and a sealed Tupperware with a label that read, Do not touch, Celia's last scoop. I kid you not. The thing was dated 2 days before the supper club event, and inside, hazelnut gelato. I placed it in the cooler bag I carry for Wolfe's finikier condiments and made for the exit. But I didn't make it to the hallway before I heard steps coming. Up the stairwell, too quick, too familiar with the rhythm. I ducked back, left the door ajar and waited. The man who entered 5B wasn't a burglar. Too polished, brown coat, gloves, sunglasses at dusk. He closed the door behind him softly, then turned toward the living room like he'd done it a dozen times. That's when I stepped out behind him and tapped him on the shoulder with the barrel of my .38. Looking for leftovers? He froze, turned and then smiled like we were old pals who'd just reunited over a chessboard. You're Goodwin. Keep going. I was worried. Celia's been missing. I came to check her place. Funny. Me too. But you didn't knock. I have a key, I gestured. Let's see it. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulled out a brass keychain with a fancy K monogram. I'm her editor, Philip Cass, Eats and Whispers. And you just waltz in here without calling the police? She asked me to feed her cat. There's no cat. The man blinked. There used to be. I didn't lower the gun. Start. Making sense or start walking? Cass exhaled. Okay, look, I don't know where she is, but I do know she was scared. She'd been receiving letters, threats, someone accusing her of spoiling the finale. I told her to take time off. She agreed, but she didn't say where she was going. Said it had to be earned. That was the word. Earned. You keep the letters. He nodded. Photocopied them. Originals were torn up. Hand them over. Wolfe wants everything. That. Name hit him like a slap. He paled. I thought this was internal. It's not. He handed me a manila envelope from his bag, then stared at the gelato cooler. She brought that in the day before she vanished. Said it was part of a review, but she hadn't written a word about it. Maybe she didn't get the chance. I let him leave, but not before copying his plate and photographing his license. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe barely glanced up when I entered. I gave him the gelato, the Cass file, the letter fragments. He skimmed, sipped beer, and closed his eyes. Then he said, "He's an accomplice, but not the architect." You sure? Too sloppy. And frightened. Whoever V is, he would. Not share authorship. Then what now? Now we invite Drago. Here? Yes, tomorrow, noon. Use your handwriting. The real one. I nodded. And what bait do I use? Wolfe grinned. Tell him we're preparing his final course. That should intrigue him. Wolfe made it clear he wanted the invitation to Drago penned in my hand. Not typed, not dictated. Handwritten with my exact slant and spacing. It felt like a performance in itself, almost like Wolfe wanted our mysterious V to see it, to recognize the loops and flourishes and be reminded that we'd taken the bait, snapped the trap shut, and reset it with sharper teeth. The note was brief, veiled and calculated to poke at the kind of man who names his restaurant alibi and throws parties themed after people's last meals. It read, Mr. Drago, a matter concerning one of your recent supper club guests requires clarification. Kindly arrive at the address below at noon tomorrow. Come prepared to discuss final courses. Sincerely, Archie Goodwin. I dropped it by his club that evening, handed it to the host with a tip large enough to ensure delivery, and got out before anyone asked too many questions. Wolfe, meanwhile, did not sleep, or rather, he pretended not to sleep, because the next morning Fritz told me the master of the house hadn't touched his usual 9-hour quota. He'd stayed up in the office, lights dimmed, rereading Cass's photocopied threats to Celia, and cross-referencing them against my stolen notebook, Bellini's testimony, and the contents of the gelato container we'd snatched from her apartment. He also hadn't eaten breakfast, which by itself was reason enough to call Saul, Lon, and Fred in for backup. Noon, Archie, Wolfe said at 11:53 a.m., means 12 o'clock, not 12:02. When he rings, let him stew for 1 minute, no more, and when you bring him in, say nothing. I'll try my best not to shine, I said. The buzzer rang precisely at the top of the hour. I waited the full 60 seconds, opened the door, and there stood Lorenzo Drago in a dove-grey jacket, tailored like it had been stitched around his ego. He was tan, smooth, and smiling, like a man walking into a room he already owned. Mr. Goodwin, he said with a bow, I must admit I'm curious. That's a good place to start, I said, stepping aside. I led him through the hallway, down the panelled corridor, and into Wolfe's office. As always, the air was thick with polished wood, old paper, and the ever-present whiff of Fritz's recent lunch prep, veal bones and time today, if I wasn't mistaken. Wolfe was seated in his chair like a man sculpted from quiet authority. Drago, to his credit, didn't flinch. Nero Wolfe, he said, a rare pleasure. Sit, Wolfe replied, not looking up, and we'll see whether the pleasure sustains. Drago sat, crossed one leg over the other, rested his hand on the cane he didn't need. He had the face of a man who'd once been beautiful, and the posture of someone who still believed he was. You requested clarification, he said. About dessert? I requested candor, Wolfe said, finally lifting his eyes. Let us begin with the event 4 nights ago. Your supper club, final, courses. An unlisted gelato served from a container prepared by Antonio Bellini. Yes, Drago said, a nostalgic touch. Bellini's hazelnut gelato was the first dessert I ever tasted in America. I asked for it as a tribute, and Mr. Bellini graciously agreed. Did he know who it was for? Drago smiled again. For me, of course. No, Wolfe said calmly. It was not. The guest list shows otherwise. The gelato was served as a final course to Celia Knott, and the order, as documented, came from a reservation made in Mr. Goodwin's name. Drago didn't blink. How very theatrical. Indeed. Was it your handwriting? No. Did you alter the reservation? No. Wolfe stared at him, flat and cold. You lie. Not with malice. With indulgence. You enjoy performance. You enjoy illusion. But you have made a miscalculation. Whoever fabricated the order in Mr. Goodwin's name had access to this house, to his personal effects, and the intent was not merely to misdirect, but to insult, to challenge. Drago spread his hands. And you think I did this? No, Wolfe said. You are not precise enough, but you are complicit. That made the smile fade. Just a flicker, but it cracked. I don't respond well to accusation. Nor to failure, I imagine, Wolfe said. Let us proceed. You and Ms. Knott, were you lovers? Drago chuckled. Oh no, I have rules about critics. No intimacy, no leverage. She was a friend. She understood me. Wolfe's tone sharpened. She disappeared after eating your curated dessert. And now you are here, not asking where she is, but posturing. Why? Drago's eyes narrowed. Because I'm being set up. I didn't touch her. I didn't make that gelato. Someone is orchestrating this to ruin me. Someone, Wolfe said, with access to you, to Bellini, to this house. Someone who seeks not death but dominance. Drago didn't speak for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. Celia was writing a piece, not for Eats and Whispers. Something deeper, investigative. She said someone at my dinners was dangerous, a regular, a collector. A collector of what? She didn't say. Just that he watched everything, took notes, and had opinions about death, final meals, said some things, shouldn't be served cold. I glanced at Wolfe. That last line matched the tone of the anonymous note exactly. Drago rose suddenly. I didn't poison her, and I didn't write that invitation. If someone used your name, Mr. Goodwin, it wasn't to frame you. It was to mock you, all of us. He headed for the door. You have a predator on your trail, gentlemen, and he's already written the menu. When he was gone, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. Archie, he said, call Lon Cohen, ask him if Eats and Whispers ever published a list of Drago's regular guests, or if Celia submitted anything off record. And if she did, we'll find our collector, and if we don't, then he finds us first. Just then the phone rang. Fritz answered, handed it to me. Saul, he said, has results. I took the receiver. Talk to me. Saul's voice was dry. The gelato you brought back from Drago's club? Unusual compound, bitter almond oil, trace amounts of a rare root, used in ancient anesthetics, not lethal, but it induces paralysis, silence, in small doses. I looked at Wolfe. Sound familiar? He opened his eyes. Yes, a message in chemical form. Anything else? Saul hesitated. Only that it wasn't present in the sample from Celia's apartment. Same flavor, different batch, I hung up. One was meant to taste good, I said. The other was meant to deliver a statement. Wolfe nodded. Yes, and the real final course is still being plated. By the time the sun dropped behind the chimney stacks that evening, Wolfe had already dictated 5 memoranda, summoned 3 operatives, and refused Fritz's roasted duck with more vehemence than I'd seen since the great caviar mislabeling of '04. He was pacing, not physically, of course, perish the thought, but mentally, reordering the case like a dinner service that had been set with a salad fork in the wrong place. The facts were simple. The arrangement, less so. Celia Knott had vanished after a dinner she wasn't meant to consume. A forged reservation in my name had put her at the center of a very particular course. The flavor, supposedly hazelnut, had been replaced with a custom concoction laced with trace sedatives, bitter almond and rare root extracts. Not enough to kill, but enough to still. And now, a note had arrived, with the tone of a self-appointed executioner and the signature of a man who called himself V. Drago, despite his perfect tailoring and imperfect poker face, had denied involvement. Claimed Celia was working on a piece about someone attending his dinners, a regular with peculiar interests, a man she called the Collector. That was the title Wolfe used as he sent Saul and Fred out on their evening missions. Find the Collector. Cross-reference every supper club guest list from Drago's last 6 months against anyone with a criminal background, a chemical record, or an obsession with culinary rituals. Narrow it down by handwriting if possible. Saul didn't flinch. Fred just took his hat and said, "Got it." That's why they're Wolfe's top 2. No drama, no discussion, just work. I, on the other hand, had a different assignment. Dig deeper into Celia's ghost. Wolfe suspected she was still alive, not because of evidence, but because of tone. "No one who murders sends poetry," he'd said. "They send threats. This man sent prose." Which meant Celia had been silenced, not destroyed. I started with Lon Cohen. Wolfe had asked me to press him gently, which in my world meant one lunch and a favor. I found Lon at a diner off Lex, buried in an omelette and 3 deadlines. "She was working on something, Archie," he said between bites. "But it wasn't for us. She'd pitched it elsewhere, said it was too intimate for Eats and Whispers. Sounded like a manifesto." "What do you mean, intimate?" Lon shrugged. "She said the subject knew her, watched her, knew what she liked, what she ate, and what she feared." I wrote that down. "She ever mention a name?" "Nope. But she said if anything happened to her, the answer was in the menu." "What menu?" She didn't say. I left Lon with his check and his cholesterol and took the next logical step, Celia's digital footprint. I had one of Wolfe's freelance hackers, a kid named Nathaniel with bad posture and worse hygiene, sweep through her online history. Nothing public, but he found a locked folder in her cloud drive titled Spoon-Fed. Password protected. She was clever, Nathaniel said over the phone. Used a cipher based on her old reviews, but I cracked it. Inside were drafts, unpublished, notes, outlines, half-formed ideas, and in one, a single line stood out. He collects final tastes. Not food, reactions, fear, delight, revulsion. He watches the face, not the fork. I read it to Wolfe when I got back. He nodded once. "Now we have him," he said. "Who?" "The man who engineered the dessert. Who used your handwriting. Who trespassed. The one Drago invited but didn't know. And he'll return." Wolfe then instructed Fritz to prepare a small batch of Bellini's hazelnut gelato. No alterations, no fancy infusions, just the real thing. "We'll need it tomorrow," he said. "For what?" "The bait." We didn't wait long. At 9:17 that evening, the buzzer rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Neither was Wolfe. I opened the door with my hand on my sidearm. The man on the other side was tall, lean, early 50s, clean-shaven, steel-grey hair, and a calm expression that struck me as deeply unnatural. He wore a scarf, despite the spring. Weather, and carried a small white box, no name offered. "You are Archie Goodwin," he said. His voice was smooth and low. "I believe you've been looking for me." I didn't answer, just let the silence do the prodding. He extended the box. "A gift. For Mr. Wolfe. Vanilla bean and rose. A personal recipe." I took it and gestured him in. Wolfe was seated, as always, and when the man entered, he did not introduce himself. He simply bowed, an old, deliberate gesture. Wolfe looked at him and said, "You are the collector." "I am," the man replied. "And your name?" He smiled faintly. "You may call me Vincent, or V, whichever fits the flavor." I said nothing. Neither did Wolfe. It was like watching 2 lions assess each other through a fence neither wanted to admit was electric. "I wanted to see you," Vincent said. "I wanted to see if you understood the point." "The gelato?" Wolfe asked. "No." The silence. Celia spoke too soon, about something she didn't understand. And what was that? The power of restraint. She was about to spoil the composition. So I removed her. Wolfe leaned back. "You're a coward." Vincent's eyes flicked. I'm a curator. You drugged a critic and disappeared her. I gave her space. She'll return, eventually. Where is she? Vincent smiled. Safe, preserved. That was all I needed. I nodded, and Saul stepped out from the shadowed corner where he'd been waiting. Vincent didn't move. I assumed you'd trap me, he said. You trapped yourself, Wolfe said, when you walked in here with a confession inside a pastry box. The lab confirmed the contents later, same compound. Bitter almond, traces of monk's root. Vincent didn't resist, just said, Tell Bellini his gelato is sublime. The moment Saul cuffed Vincent and escorted him down the front steps into the waiting car, prearranged with Lon Cohen's quiet contacts in law enforcement, not the full brass band of Manhattan homicide, Wolfe did something rare. He exhaled. Not a sigh exactly, more like a controlled release of air, the kind that says a long-held weight just loosened by half an inch. Fritz closed the front door behind Saul and Vincent with all the dignity of a curtain drop on Act 2. Wolfe remained, seated, hands folded across the vast plain of his stomach, watching the fire that had long since gone out. Did you notice his shoes, Archie? He asked. I was busy staring at the box full of botanical tranquilizers, but sure. Black leather, shined. Exactly, overshined. For a man who calls himself a curator of silence, he walked in like a lounge act. I thought he wanted to be caught. He did, but not by the law, by us. He wanted the recognition. He considered himself an artist. The disappearance of Ms. Knott was not an act of violence. It was a composition. The silence that followed, a part of his opus. What he sought from us was critique. Well, he got reviewed. 2 stars and handcuffs. But Wolfe didn't smile. He reached for the folder marked V, opened it, and slid out the final page Celia Knott had written, the one Nathaniel had decrypted. The draft Wolfe had read 6 times already, each time with the expression of a man trying to diagnose a rot in an otherwise flawless tomato. I reread the line. He collects final tastes. Not food, reactions, fear, delight, revulsion. He watches the face, not the fork. He didn't poison her, Wolfe murmured. He preserved her. I stopped short. Say again? Wolfe looked at me like a schoolmaster delivering a final lesson. You said the gelato in Celia's apartment was genuine. Same flavor, no sedatives. We assumed it was a decoy. But what if it was a clue? Vincent substituted the dessert at the supper club, but Celia took her own container home. Her scoop. Her version. You think he let her live? Yes, because she passed the test, or more precisely, she performed correctly. She responded to the substitute dish with visible disgust and left. That was the reaction he wanted. Not death. Validation. She tasted what he planted and rejected it. He considered her educated, refined, and therefore exempt. For you're saying he didn't disappear her to punish her. He did it to, reward her? Correct. To protect his ideal subject from the vulgarity of public critique. That's twisted even by Wolfe standards. Yes, he said, calmly. But logical. Vincent wasn't improvising, he was composing, and she was the audience he valued most. Then where the hell is she? Wolfe reached for the envelope Vincent had brought. Beneath the layer of tissue paper surrounding the gelato box was a second compartment, a folded square of linen, sealed with red wax. He cracked it open. Inside was an address, a storage facility. Midtown, unit number 517. Wolfe handed it to me. Go, take Saul, take the cooler. Take everything. I didn't ask questions. We rolled out at 9:52 p.m. in Saul's car, an old Buick with the suspension of a tank and a glove box full of contraband licenses. The storage unit sat beneath a glass high-rise, all chrome and cement. The night manager had been greased by Saul 20 minutes before I arrived. Keys were ready. Unit 517 looked like every other steel door in the row. No sound inside. No movement. I opened it slow. Celia Knott was sitting in the center, wrapped in a blanket, a bottle of water beside her, and a journal in her lap. She looked up as the light came in and blinked. Just once slow, Mr. Goodwin, she said. Alive, thin, pale, awake. We got her out without fuss. No ambulance, no reporters. Saul called Fritz, who cleared the guest room at the brownstone. Wolfe waited by the elevator with one hand clenched. Around a napkin when she walked in, he stood. Actually stood, Ms. Knott, he said. You've been missed. She sat on the couch like it was the first real furniture she'd seen in days. I wasn't harmed, she said. He gave me books, water, food, said I was the only one who understood the course. He preserved you, Wolfe replied. Because you rejected his flavor. Yes, he watched me taste it, saw my face, that's what he was after. The reaction. And then? He followed me home, slipped a note under my door, said I'd passed, said I should rest, that he would come to Cham explain. But he didn't? No. I locked the door and left that night, went into hiding. I was afraid if I said something, it would spoil his design. You were correct, Wolfe said. He built it with surgical precision. Your absence, his invitation, Archie's forgery, all of it part of the same orchestration. She nodded. You figured it out. Yes, but not in time. She glanced at Archie. You're not angry? Only that someone used my handwriting. I take that personally, Celia smiled. Then, for the first time since she walked in, she wept, not sobs. Just quiet tears, falling like punctuation at the end of a symphony only she had heard. Wolfe didn't offer comfort. He offered soup, Fritz. Arrived 5 minutes later with a bowl of consommé and half a baguette, sliced and warmed. So it was somehow exactly what she needed. Later that night, when the brownstone was finally quiet again, I sat in the office with Wolfe. The windows were closed, the orchids untouched. You knew he was done, I said. Yes, because the piece was complete, and if Celia hadn't responded the way he wanted, she would be dead without question. I shook my head. That's not a collector. That's a killer with a thesaurus. Wolfe allowed a half smile. Some crimes are more sinister when dressed in elegance. And Celia? She may never write again. Or she may write only about broth and salt. Either way, she lived. That is sufficient. We sat in silence. For a while. Then Wolfe spoke softly, more to himself than me. Some meals, he said, are not meant to be consumed, only remembered. By morning, the brownstone had returned to a version of normal that only looked calm on the surface. Fritz was back in the kitchen, preparing Wolfe's breakfast, eggs, soft-boiled to a microscopic degree of exactness. Celia, not freshly showered and wearing one of Wolfe's oversized guest robes, sat at the far end of the dining table, sipping tea. Her fingers still trembled a little. Wolfe had said nothing to her since his midnight remark about meals best remembered, but somehow she seemed to understand him better than most people who'd ever stood in that room. She wasn't ready to leave. We didn't ask her to. The newspapers hadn't caught a whiff of what had gone down. Not yet. Lon Cohen had held back the column as promised. No stories, no leaks. Wolfe's condition was clear. Silence until he chose otherwise. Vincent, or V, was in custody under a pseudonym for now. Wolfe had arranged that with the inspector. No immediate press, no circus. Vincent had asked for one thing before. They'd taken him away, to see the final reaction. Wolfe had declined. You will have none. The man's ego would sit in a quiet cell, starved of applause. Wolfe believed that was punishment enough. Me, I'd have gone for 20 to life with limited condiments. While Wolfe and Celia breakfasted, I stepped into the office and pulled the case folder off his desk. Everything had been meticulously filed, every note, every guest list, every photo, every copy of Celia's drafts. On top was the invitation I'd written in my own hand, the one Vincent had imitated. The curve of the letters was close, too close. I still didn't know when he'd gotten access to my notebook. Wolfe hadn't said either. At 10:15 a.m. the buzzer rang. Wolfe, chewing slowly, gave a grunt. I went to answer. It was Antonio Bellini. He looked like a man freshly dragged through his own freezer. His face was pale, suit wrinkled, and eyes wide with something just short of panic. He stepped inside without a word and held out a small box. "What's that?" I asked. "The original recipe," he muttered. "My grandfather's. Hazelnut. No substitutes. I brought it for Mr. Wolfe." Out of guilt? Out of thanks. You cleared my name. I waved him into the office. Wolfe looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Bellini, have you reflected on how your dessert became a message?" Bellini nodded. "I've hardly slept. You made it, delivered it, and yet you never asked who actually consumed it. Why?" I thought it didn't matter. Drago made it sound like a tribute, not a course. And you trusted him? I wanted to. He was family in a way. Wolfe closed his eyes, then opened them slowly. It wasn't your gelato that hurt anyone, but it was your pride that allowed it. Bellini flinched. May I ask, he said after a pause, what happens? Now? Now, Wolfe said, you serve gelato, but only to those who order it honestly. Bellini left without another word. I returned to the table. Celia was scribbling in a small journal Wolfe had lent her, a thick-bound notebook with stiff parchment. And no lines. She looked up. Am I allowed to write this? That depends, Wolfe said, on whether you wish to serve truth or spectacle. I don't know anymore. He took a sip of beer. It was past noon now, and wiped his mouth. Then write nothing, wait. If it's still in you later, it will arrive. That was his idea of therapy. After lunch, Wolfe asked me to walk Celia home. She protested, but not too hard. We rode in silence most of the way. When we reached her building, she stopped just outside the lobby. He was watching me for weeks, she said. Before the supper club. I think he was testing me. Sending desserts to my office, leaving menus in my mailbox. I ignored them. Which made you more interesting? She nodded. He wanted to see if I'd noticed the difference, if I could detect substitution. Did you? I always knew. But I said nothing. I didn't want to encourage him. Well, you passed his final, she laughed softly. Feels more like a narrow escape. I tipped my hat and let her go. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe where I'd left him. Office chair, silence. He had the old photograph Celia kept at her desk, the one of her and Drago at an early tasting event. She'd left it behind. Wolfe didn't look sentimental, but he held it like it mattered. Archie, he said, do you believe this was a murder case? No body, no blood, no weapon. But yeah, in a way. Then you must admit, Vincent succeeded. He created an atmosphere of death, without killing. Doesn't make him an artist. No, but it makes him dangerous. I sat down across from him. What was the motive? Wolfe tapped the armrest. Control. He had tasted every rare dish, traveled to every obscure country. But what he craved was something intangible. Silence, reverence, a moment where the food dictated behavior. Celia was his gallery. And we broke the frame. Yes. He turned to look at me. You did well, Archie. I blinked. Was that gratitude? Perhaps it happens. I didn't push my luck. But that night when Fritz served dessert, Bellini's proper hazelnut, I noticed Wolfe took a full scoop. He chewed slowly, deliberately savoring the texture. Then he said, to no one in particular, now this is the flavor of peace. 3 days passed without incident. The brownstone resumed its careful rhythm, like a wound clock ticking back into alignment after being jostled. Wolfe spent most of his hours in the plant room, speaking in hushed tones to an orchid with a blush-purple flare he called La Reine de Minuit. Fritz returned to experimenting with bouillabaisse variations and had forbidden me from entering the kitchen between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m., citing culinary concentration. And I, having nothing left to tail, track, or threaten, was stuck in administrative purgatory, cross-referencing expense reports, filing Saul's travel receipts, and wondering whether the printer had developed a personality disorder. Celia Knott hadn't written a word, not to Wolfe, not to the press, not to the world. She stayed off the radar, as Wolfe suggested, claiming she needed time to feel clean again. Can't blame her. Being locked in a storage unit while a culinary maniac waits for your reaction, like it's a Broadway review, would leave anyone with a sour taste. The only thing left unfinished was Vincent. The man himself hadn't spoken a syllable since his arrest. No statement, no plea, no questions. He sat in a holding cell, polished and still like a museum piece behind glass. Wolfe said he'd expected that. Collectors rarely speak after acquisition, he remarked. They observe. They do not confess. On the 4th morning, a letter arrived. Plain white envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just slid under our door sometime before dawn. I opened it, read it once, then brought it straight to Wolfe, who was in the office with a fresh bottle of beer and yesterday's Times folded open to the crossword. He took the envelope, read the contents, and set it down without a word. I picked it up again and reread it out loud. You stole the last bite. She was meant to complete it, not escape it. But I understand it's finished now. Silence resumes. Sick stared at Wolfe. You think he sent this from jail? No. No? No, he repeated, because he didn't write it. That stopped me cold. You're sure? Wolfe pointed at the letter. The phrasing is similar. The tone mimics his earlier message, but this one lacks precision. It drips with sentiment. Vincent did not possess that kind of indulgence. Then someone's impersonating the impersonator. Wolfe nodded slowly. A postscript, written by another hand. But who? That, Wolfe said, is what remains. We kept the letter, ran the handwriting past Saul's contact at the forgery lab, same one who authenticated a disputed Hemingway years ago. 2 days later, the report confirmed Wolfe's suspicion. It wasn't Vincent, but it was someone close. Celia Knott. I confronted her outside her building. She didn't deny it. He didn't get to finish, she said, eyes shaded behind sunglasses too large for her face. He wanted silence, but he made too much noise. I wrote it to give him what he wanted. You realize that makes it look like you're protecting him. I'm not, he's gone. I just didn't want his story retold by people who didn't understand the flavor. I didn't like it. Neither did Wolfe. But he let it stand. She gave him closure, he said. Let that be her last kindness. The DA still had a puzzle on their hands. No body, no violent act, just a woman removed, returned, and rendered. Silent. Technically, Vincent had broken no laws beyond trespass, unlawful restraint and some health code violations. But Wolfe provided his findings, and the lab results on the gelato sealed it. Vincent would be tried for administering controlled substances with intent to incapacitate. Not the grand finale, but enough to pull the curtain down on his opera. Bellini, meanwhile, launched a pure batch marketing campaign, swearing off custom orders and giving customers framed copies of his grandfather's original recipe with every 5th pint. Wolfe grumbled about it being distasteful, but the man had to make rent. Besides, it beat letting Drago turn the whole thing into a Netflix special. As for Drago, he kept quiet. Not a word to the press, not a denial, not an apology. Wolfe received a note from him. No return address, no signature, just one line. Some performances cost more than the ticket. Wolfe snorted when he read it. A coward's sonnet, he said, all bravado, no bone. And that, as far as the law was concerned, was that. But something still itched. Wolfe knew it. I knew it. Celia had walked away. Vincent was locked away. Bellini was scooping again. But the taste of it lingered, something left unsaid. It came to a head one evening when Wolfe finally cleared his throat at dinner and said, "You are still uncomfortable, Archie." I nodded. We never learned how he got into the brownstone. Into my drawer, into the notebook. Wolfe dabbed his lips. Indeed. You're saying you know, I suspect. Care to share? He pushed his plate forward and reached into the drawer beside him. Pulled out a small brass key, handed it to me. This was found in the envelope from Celia, alongside her handwritten postscript. She left it. No explanation. I turned it over. In my hand, engraved along the side, KF-12, storage locker? I asked. No, Wolfe said. Key to an editorial office. Eats and whispers. It's the copy Celia once gave Vincent, when she still believed he was a donor, a benefactor, a man of culinary tastes. He used it to photograph her files, including yours. I looked at the key again. She never took it back? She forgot, or he copied it. Either way, it is how he accessed the brownstone. I frowned. But how'd he get into the brownstone? Wolfe sipped his beer. Once he had your script, he could impersonate you. He made a service call, claimed you were locked out. Fritz let him in. For 5 minutes. I sat back in my chair. Fritz? He remembers the call now, believed it was you, voice was similar. And you didn't tell me sooner? There was no benefit in burdening you with guilt you didn't earn. That was Wolfe's way of saying, I handled it. Let it rest. Still, it chilled me. The man had gotten that close, used my name, my hand. My house, Wolfe raised his glass. To intrusion, he said, which like vinegar sharpens the palate if not overused. I lifted mine too. To silence, I said, may it stay in storage. We drank. And for the first time in weeks, the brownstone was quiet. Not a strained quiet, not a haunted one, just peace. Spring fully took hold of New York the following week. The city thawed. The street vendors returned with suspicious hot dogs. The sidewalks reclaimed their usual perfume of espresso, damp concrete, and overheard bickering. And inside the brownstone, life followed the only rhythm Wolfe allowed. Orchid feedings, midday meals, long silences, and the occasional intrusion of the human condition in the form of cases, clients, or, if we were lucky, mail that wasn't. A bill I thought the Gelato case had wrapped. Wolfe had tied the ribbon, filed the names, and made his final deduction. But there was still one thing he hadn't done. He hadn't spoken to Vincent, and I knew that bothered him. Vincent was still being held at a temporary facility downtown, awaiting transfer. Wolfe hadn't visited, hadn't written, hadn't sent so much as a message. But I knew he'd been thinking about it, because he kept rereading Celia's last note, the one written in Vincent's mimicry. And each time he'd stare just a second too long at the signature. "You want to see him?" I said one morning. "No," Wolfe replied. "Yes, you do." He didn't answer. That, for Wolfe, was the same as confession. The next day, he surprised me, something he reserves for eclipses and international calamities. He told me to make an appointment with Vincent's holding facility. "I will speak," he said, "with the man who stole silence." The visit was scheduled for 11 a.m. I wheeled Wolfe in, the elevator operator giving us the usual looks, curiosity, pity, reverence. Wolfe didn't notice or didn't care. Vincent was brought to the visitor's room without handcuffs. He walked like he was being watched by museum guards, chin up, back straight. His eyes lit up when he saw Wolfe, the way a fanatic might greet a returning prophet. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "to what do I owe this?" Wolfe didn't respond right away, just studied him, observed the lines in his face, the angle of his shoulders. Then he said, "You failed." Vincent blinked. "I don't agree." "Of course not, that is why you failed." Vincent tilted his head. "You understood what I was doing. You followed the structure, the symbolism." "Yes," Wolfe said, "and I destroyed it. Because it was flawed." "Flawed how?" "You made one incorrect assumption." Vincent leaned forward. "Do tell." "You believed silence is power. That withholding a voice creates something purer. But silence without consent is not refinement. It is theft." Vincent didn't move. "You removed Celia from her life," Wolfe continued, "from her agency. You decided for her that her reaction was enough, that she had played her part. But art is not finished when the audience claps. It is finished when the artist walks away. You did not walk away, you lingered. You demanded she stay quiet. That made you a jailer, not a curator." Vincent's smile had faded. "You wanted her still, preserved like an exhibit. But she lived. She moved, she spoke, and in doing so she undid you." "I let her go," Vincent said softly. "No," Wolfe said. "She escaped, with her palate intact." Vincent sat back. Wolfe leaned forward, which in his case is a seismic gesture. "You want immortality through silence. But silence decays. It fades. Echoes are louder. She will write again, and you will be forgotten." For the first time, Vincent looked uncertain. His hands trembled slightly in his lap. He tried to form a sentence, but Wolfe had already stood, or at least made the first motion to do so. "I have no more to say," Wolfe muttered, "because you are already over." We left him like that, alone, unsatisfied, unheard. Back at the brownstone, Fritz had prepared a risotto with shaved truffle and pan-seared duck breast. Wolfe ate without his usual critique. I waited until he set down his fork before saying, "That felt personal." "It was," he said. "He trespassed in my home, and then he trespassed in language." He paused. "That I cannot abide." Later that evening, Celia returned, not to stay, just to visit. She brought with her a single envelope. Inside was the first full page of her new draft. Wolfe didn't ask to read it. He simply said, "Has the flavor returned?" "It never." "Seft," she replied. "I just needed to taste the silence first." She stayed for tea. Bellini sent one more gift the following week, a small brass scoop engraved with Wolfe's name and the words, "Final course, never final." Wolfe didn't display it, but he placed it in the drawer beside his fountain pens. where only things of quiet importance go. As for me, I closed the case file and wrote one final note in the margin. He came for silence. He left with nothing. And still, Wolfe won without. Ever rising from his chair, that night, Fritz served gelato, just one scoop hazelnut made from Bellini's original recipe. I watched Wolfe taste it, pause, and finally speak. It holds. I nodded. Flavor intact? No, Wolfe said. Improved. We finished the dessert, not with clapping, not with questions, just with peace.